Hi, this is Recompile again, and in this video we're going to pick up where we left off and we're going to start rescaling our X and Y axes on some of our maps, particularly our fuel map. So before we actually get into the rescaling task, you might be wondering what the point is, and you may actually have another question as far as how the ECU handles occurrences where you're hitting load or RPM values that don't fall precisely on any of these cells. So for example, if you're at 130 load at 3250 RPM, you're essentially in the middle of four different cells. You're in between two load cells and you're in between two RPM cells. So with these four options for the ECU to choose, all it's doing is interpolating between these four what the appropriate air fuel value will be and what it will actually use. So given that information, you can understand how it might be useful to edit these scaled values. Because in some cases you'll want a little bit more precision over what it is that you're editing in these maps, and if you never ever rescale your load or RPM axes, you'll basically never have any additional control or any more precise control or any additional resolution in being able to edit your tune. So it may be problematic when you run into a situation like we mentioned here, where in order for you to be able to confidently say that you've corrected, let's say you have an air fuel problem at the 130 load, 3250 RPM data log point from your data log, you basically have to change four cell values in order to attempt to heal that, or you should be changing these four. So in order to assist the precision of your tune, in order to make it more useful to you, and in order to better make use of the limited amount of space that we have here, we basically can rescale these axes to give us a different set of information to work with. And the other point I'll bring up is that whenever it goes out of bounds of the scales that we've set up, it's basically just going to continue to use the outer bounded values that exist on the edges of the map. So if we go beyond 300 load, beyond 7500 RPM, and so on, we're going to be using these outer values. So it's not necessarily that fuel will continue to will stop flowing after 300 load, but you won't really have any control over it. So it's important to be aware of what your needs are in terms of load and what your needs are in terms of RPM. This is a common oversight of tuners or people who do quick down and dirty tunes that don't really have any interest in giving you any high level of precision over what's in your maps. And they really just want to kind of set it up quickly and get you out the door. So it's sad to see in some cases people just neglect to even care about what goes on in these maps, but you should be aware of it, and you should be able to take advantage of it. Now the other thing that's worth noting is that you'll note that my Evo 9 ROM has a pretty decent sized fuel table, and the timing table is even more impressive in terms of size. You can fit quite a bit of data in here, so you have a lot of space to work with. You have quite a few RPM values, quite a few load values. So it's nice. The Evo 9 is twice as big as an Evo 8 ROM, so they've been able to cram some more information into here. So if you have an Evo 8, you might be a little envious of this, but if you do have an Evo 8, it's even more of an important lesson to learn here as far as rescaling these guys, because you're going to have even less space to work with, so it'll be vital that you understand how to rescale to your benefit. So working off my Evo 9 ROM, let's just kind of take a glance at how it's set up from the factory. So initially we're moving in increments of 10 here across the load scale, from 10 to 20 and so on. Once we get to 100, it's going to start going up by 20s, until we hit our upper bounded 300. So let's say, for example, that you've done a bigger turbo upgrade. You're running a significant amount of boost. Maybe you have E85 or methane injection or race gas, and you're exceeding 300. Let's say you're going up to 350 load. So there's a few things we'll have to do in order to maintain a reasonable level of control over your tune once you exceed 300. And the way we'll do that is by rescaling all of these values and then essentially shifting everything that we have below here into new positions that match up with where they should actually be in terms of load. So from the factory, you'll note that there's a lot of information here that seems pretty redundant. I mean, we have a good quarter of the map from the factory is 14/7s, and even the first 4 complete columns of data here are 100% identical. So if there's a spot that you can reclaim some space, this is definitely it right here, because there is absolutely nothing different from column to column in this vicinity here. So given that information, we know for sure that we can cut all this down to even just 1 column of load. So let's say we're going to shift everything from 50 and up down to this position here. So basically I've just highlighted everything from 50 and up, and I've hit Control C to copy. Select the 20 cell to where we want to move it to, and I'll paste it. So it's shifted everything down. We go from 10 directly to 50, we skip everything in between, and now we have 300 up here. So in order to make it look a little bit nicer, we'll just continue this progression of 20 load increments, and we'll go 320, 340, and 360. So now we've expanded our fuel map to be able to allow tunability into levels of load beyond 300, and we've done that by eliminating all the redundant cells that are below 50. Now if you notice, nothing else happens in the map below, so you have to be careful when you do this, because nothing else gets shifted along with that. So as soon as we change these load values, we're changing the tune significantly. We've made a large jump in terms of how much fuel the car is going to be using. So if we just saved this and flashed it back to the car, we could potentially be in a really dangerous state in terms of fuel, because we haven't made any other corrections in the fuel map below. So you do unfortunately have to go through and figure out what exactly you want to do with this data down here after you've figured out what you want your load scaling to look like up top. So what I've done is I've taken all these values that represent everything from 50 to 300, and I'll do the same, copy and paste. And everything beyond 300 up here, this kind of isn't the exact data we need. So here's another example. If you recall in our last video, we went over the interpolate function. But here's a great use for it. So for viewability's sake, I'll just get everything as low as possible here. 7.4 happens to be the lowest you can put in a fuel map. And I'll just select everything in 300. That's the highest realistic column that we had from our original map. We didn't have anything beyond 300. We'll go ahead and paste it into 360. We'll select everything in that column, and we'll do an add of -1. So we'll basically make it a full AFR point richer. So after having done that, we can select this entire region, interpolate horizontally, and we end up with a smoothed, richening progression After we exceed 300, we get continually richer until we hit our safety margin of 360. So if you had a car, for example, that was using 320 or 330 or 340 or 350 load, this might not be a bad place to start in terms of setting up your map to be accessible to the cells that you need when you're cross-referencing your data logs with ecuflash. So you may want to just double-check your work. You can always save it as something else and bring up the original instance, and then look at the two side by side. I'll do that now just to show you what I mean. If we reopen our original and bring up this fuel map, it allows us to just check our work, and I recommend you do this because the last thing you want to do is make significant changes to your fuel map and have something go wrong. So if we look, we can just kind of do a visual check here. We brought everything starting with maybe 12 fives at the bottom here from 50. That does seem to match up. And we'll do a couple spot checks along the way. At 140 load, we're having maybe 13.5, 13.1 in here. That looks right. And down the end here at 260, which if 140 is good, 260 is probably going to be good. And it looks like it is. So we verified our work visually. I would say this is getting close to being safe to flash to the car. But before we do that, you always have to remember, back in our earlier videos, we touched upon the topic that this scaling lives in a common address, and this is not the only map that utilizes this scaling. So you do have to remember that when you adjust the scaling, other things will be affected. And by other things, I mean the low octane fuel map. So if we look at these visually, we can see that if we flashed it to the car in this current state, the low octane fuel map is actually significantly leaner in most of this map than the high octane counterpart, which in general in a tuned Evo is not what you go for. So we can take the approach of putting everything from the high octane fuel map into the low octane fuel map initially, and doing a very simple, straightforward addition or subtraction, technically, of one AFR point for everything over 100 load, everything that's under positive boost pressure. Now this method that I've taken of selecting everything in positive plus 100 engine load and adding and subtracting values, that may not be the ideal way to set up a low octane fuel map or a low octane timing map, but in my opinion, you don't really need to spend too much time on these maps, because if your tune is good, you'll almost never be utilizing them. So to spend more than a few seconds, going into detail about how you want the low octane fuel and timing maps to look, really seems like a waste of time in my opinion. All you want to do is worry about your high octane map being 8.5% safe, and the other minor percent of time that you encounter low octane maps, it's at least a moderate amount more conservative than your high octane maps. So you don't worry about too much, at least I don't worry too much about these values that live in the low octane fuel map, so long as they do their job, and in the case of fuel, add some, in the case of timing, subtract some. So that's the general idea behind rescaling the engine load columns. You can rescale the RPM rows the same exact way. So just to give you a quick example, let's say we needed to add the 8,000 RPM row here, because let's say we've got a nice set of cams, nice valve train upgrade, and we want to rev this guy to 8 grand, and we want to be able to tune it when it's up there. So if that's the case, you can probably find pretty simply two rows that look identical or almost identical, and it just so happens that the 500 and 1000 do happen to be identical. So that makes it really easy for us. We can basically just shift everything up and kill off that 500 value and set up 8000 at the bottom. And of course, when we do that, we've basically got to move the rest of the map as well, because it doesn't get moved on its own. And now that we've got this extra line down here at the bottom for 8000 RPM, we can begin to tune that. Or we can possibly maybe take away 0.1 AFR just to go a little bit richer than it was at 7500. So in just a few keystrokes and a few copy and paste commands, we've basically redefined the entire structure of this fuel map and given access to the tuner to a whole new set of tunable cells. So all these highlighted cells are cells that just did not exist in the stock form. And by having access to them and using them to your advantage, you'll be able to use to obtain a more precise tune with a little bit better resolution. Now you can also do things a little bit more advanced than just shifting things left and right, up and down. Is you can get even more specific in terms of the cells that you want to put into these columns. So in the case where we go from 50 to 60 to 70 to 80 to 90 to 100, it doesn't always seem appropriate, depending on how much space you have. Like I said, particularly if you got an older Evo 8, where your space is very limited, but to have 6 cells to deal with load between 50 and 100 is pretty excessive, and you can tell that there's not really too many changes that go on in between these values. Now, I'm not going to suggest we go directly from 50 to 100, but we may be able to jump from 50 to 70 to 90 to 100 and eliminate the 60 and the 80 columns. Because, you know what, they're not necessarily going to be required to have the car run 100% perfectly or have the car run properly. Having the ECU interpolate for the 60 and 70 by way of having this data in the 50 and this data in the 70 and this data in the 90 should be sufficient. And I haven't encountered any problems with drivability. I've done this on all kinds of Evos, 8s, 9s, and so on, where I've basically reduced this entire 14.7 area of the map, which on the original fuel map is quite large, and regained a lot of this space on the other side of the map for actual wide open throttle tunability's sake. So I've been able to condense this down considerably when you get into some more intricate scalings. So you can do something along those lines. You can omit the 60, the 80. You can add, if in particular, it may just so happen that if for a majority of your wide open throttle time, let's say for example, the majority of your time from between 4,000 and 6,000 RPM, you're experiencing 270 load. Well, 270 is going to be right in between what we have in our map here for editable values, directly in between 260 and 280. So you'll always have an interpolated value for your 270, and you won't have any direct control over how much timing is run. You'll have to edit 2 values for every one that you want to change. So if that's the case and you happen to have a need for a 270 column here, that would be an example of why you would want to kick one off of the lower end, move everything down a spot, and add a 270 column. So why don't we do that now just for demonstrative purposes. So we'll take 70 to 260 and we'll bump it down. And now we've got two 260s. We'll make the second one a 270. And we'll take all of the cells that were beneath the 70 to 260 that we just shifted, and we'll shift them as well. And now we basically have duplicated data here. So whatever we had in 260, we now also have in 270. But when you go out and tune in data log, if you've got 270 being your predominant load value that you're logging between 4 and 6,000, now you really only have to worry predominantly or initially about what's in this column without spending too much time worrying about what's in those neighboring columns. And there's really not any additional benefit in going any more specific than maybe an increment of 10 here. Load fluctuates pretty quickly, so it's not like you're going to benefit out of adding a 265 in between your 260 and your 270. To have an entire column in use for just a load difference of only 5 load, that's a little bit excessive in terms of how much resolution you need in your maps. But it's not unreasonable to utilize 1 or 2 areas where you just want that one extra column in order to gain a little bit more control over what goes on. So all these things apply for both the fuel and the timing maps. They apply for any other maps really that utilize a scaling that's adjustable. So if you're controlling boosts with the stock ECU, and we look at our baseline wastegate duty cycle, one of the things that I've done since I use the stock boost solenoid is I've noticed that the RPM scale on the baseline wastegate duty cycle, it gets a little more specific than I need it to, especially having a bigger turbo than stock. It really doesn't do me any good to change wastegate duty cycle 3 or 4 times just in between 2000 and 2750 RPM. Really, only 1 or 2 values will do just fine there. So I can probably, just to give you a quick visual of what this might look like, I can probably rescale this guy in a matter of a few seconds from 1000 to 2000 to 3000. And then maybe now I'd like to use 500 RPM increments and maybe even 250 RPM increments, where boost is really starting to pick up now. And that's when I really need to get specific as far as how much wastegate duty cycle I'm utilizing. But when you do something like this, this is a little bit easier to worry about because you only have a 2D table where you don't have to shift things necessarily as much or at all. If you're tuning from scratch, if you're tuning wastegate duty cycle from scratch, you may just set these guys all to 20 or to 0, to 10, and just start from scratch there. I'll just finish entering values in here just so you can get an idea. So this might be a more useful scaling for someone who's got a little bit bigger turbo. Maybe it spools up a little bit later than stock, and they want to rev it a little bit higher. You might get more benefit out of having your resolution not in the 2000, 2200 RPM range like the stock scaling does on wastegate duty cycle, but in the upper end, in the mid range here, where we hit 3750 to 4750, where we want a lot of our precise control to control boost spikes and so on. So this concept of rescaling tables, it applies to pretty much every 2D or 3D table in ecuflash. So it's a good skill to have, and it's good to use, like I said, especially when you don't have much real estate here. So hopefully you have an idea now of how exactly to rescale an axis and why you would do so, and hopefully you can utilize ecuflash's interpolate functions if necessary to kind of round off the newly created areas of your maps once you're done rescaling.